Thank you, Tracy. Prime Minister, ministers, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. It's a real privilege to be with you all today. And a little bit of trepidation trying to describe the impact of global trends on Papua New Guinea without providing you with too depressing an overview. But you'll be pleased to hear that there are as many opportunities, I think, in the way in which geopolitical developments are unfolding as there are risks. And I'll talk you through some of those as we go forward. So first up, it's pretty clear to say that there's been a very close convergence of geopolitics and business over the last perhaps 10 years or so. And I'd say that CEOs around the world were perhaps pretty unfamiliar with dealing with geopolitical risks. It was traditionally the purview of governments. But as economic security has become an increasing focus, and as levels of trust have really diminished between countries, businesses find themselves being more and more closely tied up with geopolitical trends. There's, as I mentioned, this global trend towards more economic security policy. And clearly, when you're tying your economics and your security policies together, there are going to be some implications for business. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time just talking about how we got to where we are today in terms of some of this economic security policy. I would argue that really we saw three phases of this. The first from 2017, with the Trump administration in the United States trying to balance the trade deficit it had with China. So we saw the US focusing on trade as a national security focus, which very quickly expanded to include technology with the pushback against Huawei 5G rollouts around the world. Not exclusively focused on the US, other countries were also looking at it. And then phase two was really COVID. And if you think of governments looking through through a national security lens at their economies, I think the aperture of that lens really expanded in 2020 to include supply chains and healthcare, of course, with the onset of COVID. And then phase three was really a big game changer, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We saw governments looking at entire energy and food supply chains through this national security lens. So really, the sectors that are being touched by economic security policy are continuing to expand. So that brings us to 2023. And I'd argue that the next 10 years, if I can paraphrase the US national security strategy, are going to be a decisive decade. Now, as you can see from some of the other lines up here on the screen, it's not just the United States that considers the next decade to be decisive. There are a number of pretty critical issues that governments need to address in partnership with the private sector and so on to address relationships between countries, climate change, future pandemics and economic shocks. So the decade is going to be decisive, and I'd argue that it's also going to be quite untidy. And what we've got here are 6 themes that we think are going to be the most important for the business sector going forward. These are those geopolitical themes that are really going to impact businesses. So we've got the uneven energy transition, and some of the esteemed speakers today have already talked about some of the issues that are connected with that. We've got new trading patterns, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit more detail. Trusted technologies. This is this sort of creation of almost 2 technological ecosystems, one driven by the United States, the other driven by China, and a number of other countries in the world increasingly being forced to choose sides. We've also got a big improvement, or a big step up, should I say, in industrial policy around the world. When the US National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, gives a speech on the US economy, you know that we've really gone through a paradigm shift where the leader of the free market is thinking very much about industrial policy and economic security. And they're not alone. Countries around the world are thinking the same way and rolling out large amounts of capital to address some of these big challenges. Defence is clearly going to be a focus. We've got competition between the US and China, and then, of course, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, a big step up in defence spending in Europe, and indeed a big step up in defence spending in this part of the world as well. The challenge will be, like many things, including the energy transition, there's been a massive increase in demand for some of these defence pieces of equipment, but there hasn't been a requisite uptick in supply. So there is going to be a mismatch until that industrial base starts to build again. And then finally, I think we've got a big focus on ideology over the next 10 years, where we have albeit not a description that's being used as frequently, but it was certainly being used a lot after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, this concept of democracies versus autocracies. And we do have alternate models of governance that are being sort of exported around the world, or at least showcased. And I think both sides are going to have fairly receptive responses depending on which part of the world we're talking about. The competition in the Global South is a really good example. So from the PNG perspective, I think two of those trends really stand out to me. The first is the uneven energy transition. The International Energy Agency, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, started to put economic security back on the list as a top priority alongside the energy transition. And of course, in Europe, we saw a rush for alternate sources of gas as Russian piped gas was closed off as an option for them. And this is where we've started to see this concept of good energy and bad energy. Some countries are putting a values proposition on where they get their energy from, and others are not. But it is creating pretty significant ruptures in the energy trading system. I think a member of the European Parliament mentioned this idea of needing to de-Putinise and then we can decarbonise. Perhaps that's more an extreme view, but the idea is that you've got this potential tension between economic security energy security and the energy transition. Now, those things aren't necessarily mutually exclusive. As Europe starts to build up some renewables within Europe, of course, it's starting to build its own energy security. And I think that is a message that's starting to resonate in other parts of the world as well, that those two things are not mutually exclusive. We're also seeing the hydrocarbon superpowers, for want of a better expression, wielding their geopolitical muscle as they realise that the heft they have with that hydrocarbon power potentially starts to ebb as countries around the world ramp up their energy transition. A really good example of this, of course, is the subsequent OPEC Plus production cuts we've seen, which have really been driven by Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia obviously would like the oil price to be at a certain level because they have their own transition plans for their economy that they would like to achieve. And in order to do that, they need a high price. On the other end of the spectrum, I think we have the sort of renewable energy superpowers, China being a very good example, of course, a country that dominates critical minerals production, but also the output of some of the solar panels and wind turbines that we need in the early stages of this energy transition. And we have started to see some export controls being put on some of those critical minerals in the last 6 months or so, starting with gallium and germanium, two metals or minerals, that are needed for telephones, handsets, and also semiconductors. And then in the last few weeks, an export control that's probably going to come out in December on graphite, which of course is a critically important component for EV battery production. Shot across the bows, perhaps, as they tussle with the United States in terms of the sorts of intellectual property that's allowed to go into China's semiconductors, but a really good example, I think, of the geopolitical power that countries will wield in the uneven energy transition that we all need to be mindful of. There's also going to be, I mentioned before, in the defence space, but equally in the energy transition, a real impact of demand surge and supply constraints. I think 2022 was very much a watershed year. You had geopolitical drivers in Europe, which really forced Europe to ramp up alternate sources of energy supply and speed up demand for the energy transition. And then in the United States, you had one of the biggest pieces of industrial policy ever in the Inflation Reduction Act, again, really ramping up demand for renewable energy sources, part of which will be funded, of course, through increased industrial policy. And again, I think there is going to be a gap there between the supply and demand factors. Again, potentially something that is of benefit for Papua New Guinea. And then the other sort of issue that I wanted to drill down on with that untidy acronym is new trading patterns. New trading patterns really isolates this phenomenon that we've seen. We're hearing a lot of language about nearshoring, onshoring and friendshoring, which is very much really the US and its allies, the G7, looking at trying to build up more resilient supply chains for those critical inputs for their economies over the next 10 to 20 years. So if at one end of the spectrum you have nearshoring, onshoring and friendshoring, I'd say at the other end of the spectrum, a pretty clever analyst described the countries as the axis of the excluded. You have Russia, Iran, and North Korea that are looking to build or to insulate themselves across the biggest impacts of the US dollar's dominance globally. So I think if you look at those two extremes of the spectrum, the rest of the world is really trying to play that middle ground of hedging between those two extremes, with differing degrees of extremity, of course. And the BRICS Plus grouping of countries is a really good example, where BRICS met 2 to 3 months ago, and there was a decision to expand that grouping of countries to include 6 more. I think that is really the world in which the US sort of driven a sort of allied community will be trying to shape and influence. And then, of course, at the other end, you have other powers that are also looking to shape and influence to their benefit. And again, potentially PNG does stand to sit quite well in that new environment that we're dealing with. So if we wrap it up with what it all means for PNG, I'm quite pleased to say that, having listened to most of the sessions today, this does accord quite nicely with some of the esteemed speakers and what they've been talking about in terms of the opportunity play for Papua New Guinea. Of course, PNG is in a key geographic location. When you're thinking about the biggest sort of engines of economic growth for the next 20 to 30 years with China and the United States, and with Papua New Guinea's closest trading partner, Australia, there are no choke points. You know, Papua New Guinea can provide the sorts of things that those economies need pretty easily, and vice versa, without fear of interdiction, or at least less fear of interdiction than others. I think the other aspect here, of course, is the energy transition play. Gas being a transitional energy for many of Papua New Guinea's closest trading partners is going to give it really good strength in terms of its relationships moving forward. And of course, we've heard today from another speaker about the potential untapped and as yet unexplored critical and rare earth minerals play in Papua New Guinea, which will no doubt be the subject of great interest internationally. And if I can finish up with that growing international interest, I will not profess to say that this is an exhaustive list, but in some of my cursory research, the heads of state or the foreign ministers of Australia, France, Hungary, India, Indonesia, New Zealand, the US, and the UK have all visited Port Moresby in the last 12 months. Now, if that's not a really good indicator to show you the interest in the country and the opportunities that are potentially there for PNG and that geopolitical landscape that is shaping that opportunity play, I'm really not sure what is. And I think Papua New Guinea's sort of mantra of its foreign policy, being friends to all and enemies to none, really does stand it in good stead during what will be a decisive decade. Thank you, and I'll now hand over to our economist.